Hi, I'm Amanda McGill Johnson with Nebraska Coalition for Life-Saving Cures, otherwise known as Nebraska Cures. I am so thrilled here today to have Dr. Don Coulter with us. He is our More Scientific Achievement winner over the last 2 years, really. With the pandemic, it was an elongated time period, but he's a recipient of a $10,000 grant for his work from our organization. He will be honored formally later this month at our annual luncheon. He is at Children's Hospital and UNMC Nebraska Medicine and is the director of the Pediatric Cancer Research Group. Dr. Coulter, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you. This is a great chance to speak to you. I really appreciate it.
I'm glad that you were able to make it work with us. Anybody who does happen to pop in and watch this live, feel free to post questions in the comment section. I will start monitoring those in a few minutes. Dawn, you asked me to call you Dawn, so I'm going to try to do that. We'll spend a lot of time discussing your unique style of bringing people together for research, but let's start by hearing what it was that drew you into pediatric cancer research. You didn't start your career in medicine, you were in business and finance first, correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it wasn't necessarily by choice. I tell people often that not getting into medical school immediately after college was probably the best thing that happened to me.
Huh.
But when I finished college, I was not the best college student. I hadn't really determined how to study and how best to get grades. And so when I went sort of looking at medical schools, they all told me there's really no way that you'll ever get into medical school.
Fascinating.
So I took a temporary job actually with Charles Schwab and Company and eventually was hired on, and I worked as an account representative with Charles Schwab for 4 years. And during that time, I had the occasion to work on trust issues and things like that. And I would see sort of, unfortunately, death certificates come by my desk for people who were trying to finish out accounts. And it really sort of spurred me back into really wanting to try to get to medical school. So I had to take a lot of night classes. I did a lot of sort of extracurricular work in free health clinics. And then I just was so blessed to be mentored by a number of really, really incredible physicians to actually get me into medical school. And so I tell people often that that background, that business background, has served me at times even more than a lot of the things that I learned in medical school, because it taught me very early on about sort of team building, collaborating, those types of things. And I've also been incredibly blessed to have a number of people in my family who are very, very involved in business and have mentored me in sort of the ways of being efficient in team management and getting things done. And all of those are skills that I try to use every day.
What a lesson in just perseverance too, and
I think, yeah,
finally getting around to medicine.
yeah, I think it's true. And I think a lot of times that's incredibly important in anything that you're doing in life, whether it's medicine or research. There are many, many times where you having the ability to continue to try is an incredibly important skill.
So, what have you been able to accomplish since starting the Pediatric Cancer Research Group, and what are your current priorities? Or maybe get us to that shift even into pediatric cancer, and then
Yeah.
what you've been able to do now.
It's such a great story. So the Pediatric Cancer Research Group actually really started in 2014 with funding that came from the Senate. And that funding that came from the Nebraska Senate was really at the direction of a family that I met very early on in my career here in Nebraska. So Mitch and Carrie Allschwedt, he had a young daughter who was diagnosed with neuroblastoma. And at the time, they asked me, where is research going in this incredibly difficult cancer to treat? And I had told them that at the time, the federal government was only funding 4% of cancer research, which still is the funding gap that exists today. And
Wow.
if you think about the limited resources that we have in government, you may say, you know what, adult cancers that happen more often, like breast, prostate, those types of cancers, that's where funding goes. But what the Allschweds and I sort of discussed together is, boy, there should be some people who are really focusing on pediatric cancer. At the time, I also had sort of discovered that Nebraska had a high incidence of pediatric cancer, higher than sort of what we would expect in the rest of the country. And so that's what led us to talking to the Senate of Nebraska about, if we have these issues and we have people who sort of are maybe having a little bit of difficulty getting to the center where their pediatric care is going to be, which is in Omaha, aren't there ways that we can sort of think about that? And we were very fortunate to connect with Danielle Conrad, who at the time was one of the state senators, and she introduced a bill for $1.8 million, which was a dollar from every citizen of Nebraska, to sort of start a research entity. And when we received those funds, the whole goal was that there was going to be a report that was going to be written at the end of the year to just say what we did with the $1.8 million. So at the time, there were only three of us in the Pediatric Cancer Research Group. It was myself, a guy named Graham Sharp, and another guy named Tim McGuire. And we used those funds to sort of build the infrastructure to develop other research. And when we gave the report to the Senate, that's when they sort of said, you know what, we are on the right path with this. We're going to continue that funding every year. And that funding has led us to grow the group from 3 researchers to now over 38 researchers. We've received both internal, external, extramural, and NIH funding in the millions of dollars range. So the investment that the state has made is now bringing in more research dollars, which has led to more employment, more jobs. We've recruited scientists. We've written and published over 45 articles in journals. We have a number of projects that are developing novel therapeutics for pediatric cancer. And we really have sort of expanded the collaborative research that's done in Nebraska. And it's one of the examples that I think that a number of people look at and say, that is something that's on the right track of sort of helping to grow research.
That's amazing. Like, have you been able to learn anything more about why Nebraska might have a higher level of pediatric cancer?
Yeah, that's a great question. So with the money, we were able to do a 24-year evaluation of the data in Nebraska because if you look at data on pediatric cancer for very short timeframes, maybe 5 years or for 10 years, pediatric cancer is a rare event. It's only 2% of all of cancer. And to be a little bit strange about it, kids in Nebraska are kind of a rare event. We have 1.8 million people in Nebraska. Only about 22% of them are under the age of 19 or what we would consider having pediatric cancer. So if you look at it in a very short time frame, you might not find valid data. There may be things in that data set that sort of are changing what you're really thinking is going on. So looking at over a 24-year period of time, we were able to see that in that time frame, Nebraska had a higher incidence of pediatric cancer than what the nation was experiencing. And then we were fortunate. We published that data, and about 6 months later, the Centers for Disease Control published their own study of 14 years of data. And the nice thing was in that 14-year data set, they compared state to state to state. So the Nebraska could really look and see in that 14-year block, where do we rank within the country for pediatric cancer incidence? And the incidence of cancer in pediatrics was the 7th highest in Nebraska during that time frame. We have the
Wow.
highest incidence of pediatric cancer in the Midwest, and we often have the highest number of pediatric brain tumors in the country. And so then that leads to the next question as to where that comes from. And that's what we're trying to identify now. If you think about the incidence of pediatric cancer and how pediatric cancer develops, we really don't know. There are a few pediatric cancers where we truly know, okay, that's a cause. But the only thing that's been proven to give cancer to kids is radiation. And then the chemotherapy that we use, unfortunately, can have a secondary effect of cancer. So what we're investigating in the Pediatric Cancer Research Group is the possibility that maybe there are some environmental players, maybe in sort of our water or our soil, that could be sort of driving the pediatric cancer incidence that we see in the state. And recently there was a great gift that was given by Claire Hubbard to fund a great deal of research into the water to identify if there's anything that we can sort of see that could be problematic. And if there is, how would we get rid of that problem? What will we do to mitigate those impacts?
Do you know if we're like, I know this isn't about pediatrics, but are our adult cancer rates any different?
That's a really good question. And even though I don't study adult cancer, there are a number of people on the campus who do. And there has been some work that's been done in leukemia and lymphoma. And in the past, there are increased instances of leukemia and lymphoma in adults in Nebraska that have also been linked to nitrites and the sort of co-expression of nitrates or nitrites and different chemicals that are used in Nebraska for agriculture that can maybe cause an increased incidence of cancer. And so those are things that people have looked at in the past that we're continuing to look at in regard to pediatric cancer.
Well, you had talked about the Hubbard funding, and I don't think I had fully appreciated till I was at this organization just all of the different funding streams needed to make research happen. And talking to folks who maybe don't end up pursuing research because of the grant writing, and it all seems so daunting. And where's the money going to come from? Can you talk a little bit to that? I know you talked about lots of those different streams you have.
We are so fortunate in Nebraska to have so many philanthropic organizations that have devoted their time, talent, and energy to raising money for pediatric cancer research. And the reason why is what we sort of spoke about in the beginning. Only 4% of the federal government budget goes to pediatric cancer research. Over the last 30 years, only 3 drugs have been developed specifically for pediatric cancer. The vast majority of treatments that we have for kids are developed for adults, and then we attempt to change the doses for kids so they can tolerate them. And there are problems with that. The actual disease of pediatric cancer is biologically very different than the disease of adult cancer. And kids, they're not little adults, and so they can process the medicines in different ways. So developing something specifically for pediatric cancer or for a pediatric patient is incredibly necessary. But in doing that, you're right, the time of research costs money. And so I tell people all the time who ask me how they can get involved in research, obviously you can have a research career, you can do lab work, you can do clinical studies. But boy, by being somebody who's raising advocacy, raising awareness, or raising funding, you're on the team. And we have a number of teams who have been incredibly generous with their funds to sort of continue to drive the ability of the team to do research. So there are funds that we use to sort of hire people to assist, to buy the reagents, to do the studies, to reimburse patients, all kinds of things that those research dollars do. And writing effective grants that can get that money is an incredibly important skill that a number of people in the Pediatric Cancer Research Group have.
That's great. So you're talking a little about this dream team and all the work. So when you started working to create this dream team around pediatric cancer research, what was the status quo? And some folks may not realize that research and clinical practice don't always just organically happen together. So how did you go about building that collaboration?
Well, I think I want to just, there's been a little bit of a revolution in science, and it's been a great revolution. In years past, science was done sort of in silos. It was very important for someone who was working on a project to keep it secret until it was ready for prime time, if you will. And the reason for that is that there's a lot of other things that that researcher gets out of the work that they're doing: academic advancement, career notability, things like that. And if somebody else sees what you're doing early on the process before it's completed, in the past, that could have been problematic. What really happened was sort of this idea that that type of science is so ineffective and inefficient. We need to move towards collaborative science, where as we're working on a project, we're finding other people who are like-minded and may present similar skills or augmentary skills that we could utilize to do the project better and faster. And so that's the world that the Pediatric Cancer Research Group strives to work in. When we got started, you're exactly right. There were a number of pediatric cancer researchers on campus, but they didn't necessarily know that there was somebody else who was working in their field of pediatric cancer. Or even more importantly, there were a number of people who were doing research on adult diseases and didn't know that their research could correlate to a pediatric cancer. So that was incredibly helpful to sort of start the process of talking to folks and beginning that. I would say probably about 75% of the investigators in the Pediatric Cancer Research Group actually have their basis in adult tumors. And then because they sort of identified with the story of a child going through this process, that became a passion of theirs. And so they decided that they were going to sort of maybe reinvent some of their research, or at the same time they're researching adult tumors, research these pediatric cancers, because you can't help but be inspired by what these children and their families go through. For the other researchers who are already involved in pediatric cancer, identifying other investigators that they could sort of team with to find out best practices or efficiencies or ways to identify funding sources has been incredibly helpful. And the whole goal of the Pediatric Cancer Research Group is to be collaborative in that. But the one piece that was really missing were clinicians. So you can have a PhD researcher who has that scientific mind that's ready to come up with the questions and execute the experiments that would get those questions answered. But oftentimes what they need is a clinician, somebody who is taking care of those patients on a day-to-day basis to say, you know what, that development might not work because a child might not be able to tolerate it, or how are you going to administer it, or that's not really the problem that we're seeing in clinic. This is what we're seeing in clinic. So one of the things that the Pediatric Cancer Research Group strives to do is link these scientists with the clinicians who are seeing the patients. And that's what really brings a great deal of passion and inspiration. When you hear the stories of what we're seeing in clinic, that's what drives the research that we're trying to obtain.
Is there anything else you'd like to share just about that sharing of data and information? I had a question about that, but you have kind of discussed how the doors have opened a little bit in terms of sharing
Yeah.
information across entities and across researchers. Because sometimes that's a struggle, or working with government versus other entities can be a struggle with data sometimes.
Right, exactly right. And every revolution has people who are still sort of thinking about things in the way that we used to do it. I think as that wave continues of saying collaborative science is the only way that we are effectively and efficiently going to get things
Look
done.
at the pandemic right now and how
Exactly right.
collaborative it's had to be.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Nothing really great that we have done as a people, as a scientific community, as a country has been done in isolation. And you just listed one of the great examples of sort of the vaccines that we have now for SARS-CoV-2, but also you think about the space program or anything else like that, where when we set a goal to ourselves and then we have work in collaborative teams, we can accomplish that goal. I think a lot of the reason why the government decided to sort of look at the next phase of cancer research as a moonshot is because they wanted to sort of invoke that idea of everybody working together for a common goal. And people are way more accepting of team science now than they used to be. And it is no longer sort of the exception to the rule, it's the norm. And fortunately for us, the way that the NIH, National Institutes of Health, which are the funders of the best and brightest research around the country, they're looking for that collaborative health of those investigators matched with clinicians trying to get to the answers as fast as possible.
That's terrific. You had addressed a little while back about going to the legislature and working with Senator Conrad and others. Do you have anything else you'd like to share in terms of that advocacy with government? I should disclose, as he and I were talking before we started this, that I was a state senator, at least when this went down the path. I wasn't anymore when it finally passed, but I'm a big advocate for encouraging people to advocate at the legislature for that government support.
Yeah, I will tell you that when I started that process, I was terrified. When you sit down to testify to the legislature and you've got that light in front of you with the three buttons of red, yellow, and green, and then you have someone who's sort of taking notes on the entire thing, it just really, really feels like you need to have that stress and be concerned. But what I identified was that senators are, especially in Nebraska, are hardworking individuals who have a day job, and then their second job is being a senator. And what they're really concerned about is sort of identifying what people are concerned about and pushing for change. And the only way they hear that is if they have advocates. And the best advocates by far are the people that are right in the middle of the fight, whatever it may be. And so the advocates that come to mind for pediatric cancer are definitely the patients themselves, who I've been honored to watch adolescents speak to senators about what they go through. And then the parents who've been so kind to share what is obviously the most terrible thing they're ever going to go through, and hearing their stories as to the struggles that they feel in all of the ways that childhood cancer can impact a family. And so I encourage people all the time that if you feel passionate about something, you're going to find a senator who feels passionate about it too. Danielle Conrad was definitely a passionate senator that helped us. Heath Mello, John Stinner, Senator Coulterman. There have been a number of senators who've been touched by the hearing of the terms and the work that people are doing in pediatric cancer. It is a great, great way to raise awareness.
Senators are real people and they're very approachable by and large. I can't speak for every single 49 that are in there at a given time, but they are, and are just very interested in hearing those real stories. And I bet hearing those from those families just how heroic they are, really, and inspiring that they can be.
I can't agree with you more. In all honesty, sort of the work that we do as physicians or investigators to try to tell what the needs are and how those gaps can be filled, that can tell one part of the story. But to sort of have a family come and say, this is how it is in the real world. This is why it's so important that we get these answers. This is why it's so critical that we identify ways of helping to sort of bridge some of the gaps that may be involved in the social determinants of health. You know, in Nebraska, our state is 75,000 square miles. It's the 16th largest state in the country. And we only have 9 pediatric oncologists that work in Omaha. So that's great if you live in Omaha. It's not so great if you live in Grand Island or Atkinson or Columbus or Scotts Bluff or all these different places where our patients have to come from. And to ask them to travel 4 or 5 hours via car for therapy, that can be incredibly problematic. So there's a number of ways that advocates can share those types of information with senators, and then state senators can get involved in identifying ways that we can use modern technology to alleviate some of those issues that we see in the distribution of healthcare in a state with a rural population. All of those things, by the way, are things that we want to do in the Pediatric Cancer Research Group and continue to sort of research those ways of improving the way that we disseminate healthcare throughout our state.
Terrific. We do have a question in the chat.
Okay.
Is there any work being done in Nebraska in developing clinical trials to increase the number of possible treatments for pediatric cancer?
That's a really good question. I'm going to take that in 2 different ways. First, in Nebraska, we are a member of what's called the Children's Oncology Group. The Children's Oncology Group is a large international group of investigators that sort of leads the way on cutting edge clinical studies in pediatric cancer. And so it started in 1955, and all of the advancements that we've made in the clinical treatment of pediatric cancer to achieve the 80% survival rate that we currently enjoy is as a result of the research that's done worldwide in the Children's Oncology Group. So it's one thing that I love telling families in Nebraska, that if they come to either one of our clinical sites, the Children's Hospital Medical Center or University of Nebraska Medical Center, they can rest assured that they're receiving the same standard care that they would receive at any institution within the Children's Oncology Group. However, there are certain things that we treat outside of the Children's Oncology Group, or there might not be a therapeutic idea that's currently being advanced by the Children's Oncology Group. So we are attempting to bring more clinical trials into Nebraska to do that. For instance, we have a number of trials that we run for pediatric brain tumors. We have a number of trials that we run for stem cell transplantation that don't necessarily come through the Children's Oncology Group. But I think the heart of that question is, maybe what do we need to do to continue to advance those trials? And again, it's part of the infrastructure of doing research. If you're going to run a clinical trial, you need to have sort of the appropriate data managers, the appropriate nurses, the appropriate communicators of that trials to families, and all of that goes into the cost of research. And so as the Pediatric Cancer Research Group continues to develop, those are things that we're also looking at increasing.
Is it difficult convincing people when there are those trial opportunities to participate, or are families pretty open to that?
It's a really, really great question. And it's one of the wonderful things about my job as a clinician is sort of having that conversation with families and trying to let them know that that is their choice. What I can tell them is that we have this idea of a clinical trial, but the whole reason the trial is going on is to identify if there's going to be any sort of benefit by doing something in this different way than the way that we've been doing it before. And every family makes that choice for themselves after they sort of look at the information and decide. Many times we have enough time that they can really review, but a lot of times there's that trust that develops very rapidly between physician and family where I'm going to review the data for you as best I can, and then we make an informed decision together. I tell all the families that I have the honor of working with that we're a team. It's not going to be me just telling you definitively, this is exactly how we're doing it, and this is the way it's going to go. We work together as a team to identify, would it make sense for your child and your family to be involved in this clinic? Then the last thing that I'll say about that is all families sort of have the option of, if we're going down a pathway with a clinical study and it's becoming difficult or it's not working for the family in any of those regards, clinical studies can always be stopped and you can always come off of a clinical study. So those options are things that we talk about with our families every day.
Okay. As we're getting closer to the bottom of the half hour, the hour, do you have any thoughts or advice for students who are thinking of pursuing careers in health research or clinical service, or advice for early career scientists, especially since you're an expert on building these collaborations?
Well, the first thing that I would tell everybody over and over again is yes, you can. Because I really find that the first thing that we do when we come up with a new idea or a goal or a passion that we think we want to pursue, the very first thing we do is we negotiate against ourselves. And I find that to be one of the terrible things that we're just ingrained in as humans. We can identify all the ways why we can't. We're not smart enough. We're too old. We're too young. We don't have the experience. We consistently, at the beginning, negotiate against ourselves. And so I try to tell people, don't do that. You're going to find enough people outside of yourself in life that are going to negotiate against you. Don't join them and start. So yes, you can. The second thing is you have to find what your passion is. When I went to medical school, I didn't know anything about pediatric cancer. I wanted to be an adult cardiologist. And one day my passion came and found me. So I think you have to have open eyes to identify what your passion might be. And remember, while you're looking for it, it might be looking for you. And then once you find that passion, then it's just hard work. And that really is the differentiation between a number of people who are being successful and other people who might not be as successful. It's that work that you put into it. And then lastly, I would say that any idea or any sort of goal that you're working towards is going to be beneficial. So I talk to families all the time who say, I would love to help, but I don't think I have the time. That's totally fine. If you're talking to friends about pediatric cancer, you're raising the advocacy, you're raising awareness. That's incredibly important. Or people who think that they want to start a career in research, they're not 100% sure how to get started. That's where mentorship is incredibly important. I am the summation of a number of wonderful people, both within medicine and outside of medicine, who decided to invest in me. And you're going to find mentors along that pathway. We always talk about mentorship as this formal pathway. It doesn't have to be. You can find a mentor, having a cup of coffee who might lead you down a direction and not do anything like a formal sort of relationship in that way. But you take all those skills that people give you and you sort of know that you're not going to do it in isolation. And that's how you can be a success.
Those are all wonderful pieces of advice that really resonate with me, and just I think with across many professions even. So thank you so much for taking 30 minutes out of your day to join us and to share your expertise and your work with us. And any final last words you'd like to share?
Just real quick, I'm incredibly appreciative of your time. Anything that we do to raise the awareness of pediatric cancer, I think is incredibly important. And I thank all the people that have spent so much time sort of helping me to get to this point where I have the opportunity and the honor to work with a group of investigators like I do. They make all the difference, as do our families and our patients. And I really, really appreciate everyone's time.
Thank you very much.